Morning, everybody. This is your geography lesson for the week beginning the 11th of May. And what I suggest you do right now is you make sure you have your virtual note sets for the weather topic open. And you might also be using the PDF version of the note sets alongside that. The reason we've got a PDF note set is because the pages don't change. Whereas your virtual note set, the one that you have been handing in, as you type answers, obviously the page numbers change. So you might wish to have both documents open because these instructions do refer to the page numbers that come from the PDF. But I have also outlined the key idea that you should be reading. Right, this week we're going to do work that starts obviously on the 11th of May, and you are going to be asked to submit that by no later than Thursday the 14th. And we ask you to try to make that deadline because obviously Mr. Anderson and myself have to mark this. Right, what are we looking at this week? Well, what I first need to do is remind you what you were looking at last week. So last week we introduced you to this idea that there are large areas of air on the planet, and we call those large areas of air masses. And that these air masses, depending on where they come from, can either be cold, like we can see here on the map. We've got a huge area of cold air in the northern part coming from, in this case, we've got Siberia over here or the Arctic over here. So these are cold air masses. And then coming from the south, we have warm air masses coming from the equatorial regions like the Atlantic over here, or coming from Africa over here. And those are warm air masses. We also gave you an idea that air masses will either be very dry or very wet, and that depends on whether they come from an ocean or whether they come from a continental area. If they're coming from an ocean, they're going to be very wet because there's lots of evaporation, whereas if they're coming from a continental area, they're going to be very dry. One final idea that you will have read about and remember from last week's lesson is that when two air masses meet, you end up with this long area, and this is actually called the jet stream, but it is also what we call a weather front. So a weather front is where one air mass with certain properties, in this case, we're looking at a warm and we're looking at a wet air mass coming from the South Atlantic, is meeting a cold and wet air mass coming from the North Atlantic. And we're at the point where they meet, you've got to imagine these are like two giant walls of air hitting each other. Things start to happen, and we call this a weather front. So that's the kind of key ideas you have been introduced to so far in terms of air masses. You had to name the 5 air masses that affected the UK, and you also had to think about the next thing, which I'm just going to now go down and have a look at, which was to do with how air masses affect our lives. And there was a bit of work on the beast from the east, as well as periods of time, like in summertime when you get these extremely long, dry, hot summers where very little changes, where there's very little rainfall. How would that affect us in Scotland, for example? Right. On top of that, you got your first introduction into a really important part of the weather topic, which is air pressure. Now, whilst we will not end up talking that much actually about the air pressure, we basically need to understand whether air is high pressure or low pressure. And you were told about what the difference between these two were. It's to do with the amount of air molecules pushing down, whether there's a lot or a little. Now, why is